Hey guys, tonight we will uncover a dark, untold side of Anne Boleyn, one without the honour or forgiveness that people claim. They say Anne departed like a saint. But the reality on the scaffold at the Tower of London was so brutal that the official records were quietly altered. Henry VIII did not merely order his wife's execution, he orchestrated a psychological torture masterpiece that spanned many weeks, involving a mysterious French executioner who arrived before the trial even concluded, and an execution method engineered to maximize her suffering. This is not the sanitized version you learned in school. This is the story of how a king employed psychological warfare to break the woman who gave him her entire heart. Piece by piece, this story has been compiled from a wide array of historical sources, from ancient chronicles to modern scholarship, so please watch in full to help distinguish fact from fiction. Since we are all part of a history-loving community, if you spot any inaccuracies or have a different perspective, don't hesitate to comment below so we can discuss together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment where you are watching from and your current local time so I know now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. On the 2nd day of May, in the year 1536, right in the midst of the May Day festival at Greenwich Palace, where Anne sat quietly in the stands, gently savouring the echo of hooves and the clash of armour, Henry VIII had secretly set in motion a ruthless plot to destroy her. As the knights galloped toward one another, the very eyes of Anne's closest attendants turned into silent spies. The ladies and courtiers who once bowed before her throne were now ordered to observe her every move. They recorded each step, each gesture, every whisper carried on the wind, wielding their pens with merciless intent to erode her will and grind down the resolve of the woman who once stood shoulder to shoulder with an emperor. Amid the festive clamour, bizarre accusations were erected like veils obscuring the truth. They claimed that Anne had committed adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George. They accused her of treason, incest, even witchcraft. Every charge seemed stained with the blood of lies, extracted by torture until the innocent bowed their heads and confessed in a desperate bid to save their lives. Mark Smyton, a lowly musician, was tortured until he collapsed on the palace's cold wooden bed and uttered a confession of intimacy with the Queen. Henry Norris, one of the king's dearest friends, was promised his life if he would admit guilt. Yet when he remained steadfastly silent, he too met a tragic fate. The only evidence supporting these grave accusations consisted of contradictory confessions, with no physical proof, no love letters produced for scrutiny, just the so-called love letter that no one was ever permitted to see. The atmosphere of interrogation grew suffocating, an invisible wall pressing in on Anne, each time she drew a deep breath to steady her mind. Henry VIII did not seek justice or truth. He needed an excuse. A crime to persuade the court and the people that the Queen had betrayed the crown, that she was unworthy of the throne. Under the solemn drumbeats of May Day, Anne remained eerily composed. She fought to steady her racing heart whenever she heard whispers behind her. She betrayed the king. She abandoned the crown. She is a traitor. Those words cut deep, setting her spirit ablaze. Yet Anne kept her gaze calm and introspective. The fabrications swept through her mind like a dark tide, covering every corner of her memory, forcing her to whisper to herself, "I will not break. I must hold fast to my faith." Weeks passed since that fateful 2nd of May, and after only a handful of rehearsals for the trial, Henry was ready to stage the cruelest spectacle of all. The trial was orchestrated like a play, with a vast assembly on the benches and a jury of loyal peers hand-picked for the occasion. It was astonishing to see Anne's own confidants seated in the judges' gallery, poised to pronounce her guilty. Every detail was meticulously planned, from the toll of the bells marking the hour to the flicker of candlelight, meant to highlight the Queen's humiliation. In the hushed courtroom, Anne entered with a graceful step, each footfall carried on a cool draught, She neither protested nor pleaded. She merely cast one final glance around, as if seeking a familiar face, yet all around her, loyalty had turned to betrayal. Her mind was torment not by lash or chain, but by the deceit of those who once served her faithfully. The merciless pens erased fragments of her defense, wiping away each clear argument she had carefully crafted. When the verdict rang out, her heart tightened in her chest. 3 hours of trial had been nothing but a sham performance. The gavel had fallen before she could speak a final plea. Anna dropped her hands, smoothing the front of her cloak, still warm from her shoulders, and stepped outside with not a crease of fear on her face. Outside, the applause was thunderous, but within her soul there echoed only the broken remnants of her shattered mind. And in that moment, as the candlelight cast long shadows upon the tower's ancient walls, Anne understood that the battle was no longer with her accusers, but an internal war more brutal than any she had faced, preserving her humanity within a merciless game of power. She drew a slow, steady breath, letting the quiet, calm cradle her weary spirit before stepping forward into the silent continuation of her unspeaking tragedy. On the 15th of May, in the year 1536, a court composed of 26 nobles, all unwaveringly loyal to Henry VIII, convened in solemn form. Presiding over the proceedings was Anne's own maternal uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, a choice as chilling as it was calculated. From the moment the heavy doors closed, the air grew still and oppressive. The castle guards had sealed every corridor, their armour gleaming under torchlight, ensuring no whisper of sympathy could slip through. Within the cold stone chamber, witnesses were ushered in one by one. Each had been hand-picked for their unquestioning devotion to the crown, and each had been coerced behind closed doors until their testimonies aligned with the king's gruesome narrative. They claimed to have seen Anne consort with men in hidden gardens and dimly lit chambers, even alleging incestuous encounters with her own brother, though Anne stood before them, pale and composed. She calmly dismantled each charge with reasoned precision. She pointed out the impossibility of her presence in 2 places at once, highlighted the political motives that had led to false accusations, and reminded the court that justice must rest upon truth, not spectacle. Her words flowed like gentle water, yet they were met with unmoving stone faces. After less than 3 hours of such deliberation, the verdict was swiftly announced. Anne was found guilty of high treason, adultery, incest, and witchcraft. The sentence was left to the king's discretion, burning at the stake or execution by axe. Yet Henry had chosen a supposedly more civilized method, execution by French sword. He described it as an act of mercy, a single, clean stroke more dignified than the hack of an axe or the flames of a pyre. But in truth, this decision was another layer of his cruel theatre. Rather than summon a local executioner familiar with the harsh unpredictability of the axe, the king had issued secret orders to Jean Rombaut, a master executioner from France. Even before the trial's final words were uttered, Rombaut was already en route from Calais, crossing the channel under cover of darkness so that he might be in London at dawn. The French sword he carried was unlike any weapon Anne had ever seen. It was lighter than a battlefield blade, yet balanced with such perfection that it seemed to hum with ominous promise. Its edge had been honed to surgical sharpness, designed not only for a swift end, but to imprint the horror of that final moment into the minds of all who beheld it. Henry's plan was not born of compassion, but of psychological domination, to ensure that the Queen's death would be an unforgettable spectacle, a living testament to the consequences of defying royal will. In the days that followed the verdict, Anne's small cell in the Tower of London was prepared for the execution. The chamber that once served as her dressing room for coronation was stripped of tapestries, replaced by cold stone walls and iron bars. She was permitted a single night of private reflection, though none who cared for her were free of sorrow. Under the dim glow of a single candle, Anne knelt upon the damp floor, her gown spread like a pale cloud around her. The hush was so absolute that she could hear her own breath. Every intake, a fragile whisper against the silence. Outside, as dawn approached, the crowds gathered on Tower Hill, murmuring in subdued anticipation. Guards formed tight ranks, their halberds glinting in the pale light, ensuring that only those the king had sanctioned might witness the moment. At the appointed hour, Jean Rombaud arrived, his gait measured and composed, clad in simple black attire. His face was hidden beneath a hood, leaving only his eyes cold. Professional, devoid of mercy, visible. In his hand he held the French sword, its blade almost ethereal in the misty morning air. Anne was led from her cell, her posture regal yet laced with sorrow. She moved with quiet dignity, each step echoing upon the stone floor as though marking the passage of time itself. When she emerged onto the scaffold, built low to the ground, so every spectator could see without obstruction, the hush deepened. Anne turned her gaze upon the assembled witnesses, lords, ladies, clergy, and commoners alike, her eyes reflecting sorrow and acceptance in equal measure. She knelt on the straw-covered platform, her hands gently clasped, her head upright in the French manner. Jean Rombaud stepped forward, placing a small bundle of straw atop her shoulders to conceal the glint of the sword. Anne closed her eyes, murmured a brief prayer, and swallowed hard as though drawing courage from within. Then, in a movement swift as thought, the blade descended in one flawless arc. The crowd gasped as the sword sliced through the air, severing life in a single stroke. Anne's lips continued their silent prayer for several heartbeats, even after her head lay motionless upon the straw. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, her final act, a testament to serenity in the face of brutality. Jean Rombaud then lifted her head, displaying it for all to see. A collective hush fell, broken only by the distant clang of a halberd snapping against a guard's helmet. The Queen's eyes, still open, reflected the shock of a life extinguished, yet remained hauntingly aware for an instant longer. As if refusing to depart this world without bearing witness to her own erasure. Thus ended the spectacle Henry VIII had orchestrated, a pinnacle of psychological warfare disguised as mercy. In that moment, he cemented his power, sending a chilling message that no one, not even a queen, could escape the shadow of his authority. Over the 18 days leading up to her sentence, Anne was confined within the very palace chambers where she had once prepared for her coronation rooms, now stripped of their silken tapestries, replaced by bare stone walls, iron bars, and dimly lit corridors that swallowed all warmth. The same ladies and attendants who had once adjusted her robes and fastened her coronation cloak were now her silent jailers, standing guard around her cell and recording every step, every whispered word, every flicker of expression. Each pen stroke was calculated to chip away at her resolve. Each entry in Lady Kingston's ledger, another brick in the wall of her isolation. In the stillness of those long days, Anne's mind became a battleground. There were moments of crystalline clarity, when she would calmly deconstruct the absurdity of the charges against her, pointing out the impossibility of adultery accusations at times when she was publicly present at court, or the blatant political motivations that drove the incest rumours. Then, as if in a reflex born of unbearable tension, she would burst into involuntary laughter low, shaky giggles that echoed in the stone chamber, like a cruel mockery of her own plight. It was as though a piece of her sanity teetered on the edge, swinging between rational defence and an uncontrollable, almost despairing mirth. During those restless hours, Anne practiced the posture she would assume on the scaffold, kneeling with hands clasped, head held high in the French manner. She would count the number of paces from her bed to the cell door, gauge the distance between her throat and an imaginary blade, and repeat, in a soft voice, "How sharp is the French sword?" Her question, posed more than once a day, hung in the stale air like a prayer and a curse. She envisioned the perfect stroke Henry had promised, turning her thoughts into a grim choreography of life's final moments. Lady Kingston's reports to the court grew more detailed by the day. She wrote of Anne pausing mid-sentence to stare at the empty walls. Her gaze distant, as if seeking an unseen companion. She noted the Queen's tearful whispers about her daughter. Elizabeth's words laced with sorrow. "Forgive me. My child. I never saw your face." These secret missives, penned in Lady Kingston's careful hand, captured each breakdown and flash of defiance, feeding Henry's need to demonstrate absolute authority. Every scrap of Anne's emotion was collected, catalogued, and later presented as evidence of her madness. Yet, amidst the psychological torment, Anne found fleeting moments of compassion and maternal memory. When the evening candles were lit, she would pause her mental rehearsals and close her eyes. Picturing Elizabeth's curious smile, she would murmur, "One day you will know the truth," and then return to plotting the precise angle at which to bow her head before the blade. In those quiet interludes, the Queen reclaimed her humanity, even as the palace around her sought to erase it. By the end of those 18 haunted days, Anne's spirits were frayed, but not entirely broken. She had endured solitary confinement in the halls that once echoed with laughter, faced merciless surveillance by those she once trusted, and wrestled with the grotesque spectacle of her own impending death. Through it all, she maintained a spark of resilience, a refusal to let Henry's cruelty extinguish her dignity. In the hush before the final dawn, Anne Boleyn stood as both prisoner and prophet of her own tragedy, her weary heart beating with the quiet hope that history would one day remember her truth. On the morning of the 19th of May, in the year 1536, the sky over the Tower of London lay heavy with grey clouds. As though the heavens themselves shared in the sorrow to come, Anne rose from her narrow pallet before dawn, her breath visible in the chill air. She slipped into a morning gown of ash-grey damask, its fabric soft and sombre, and drew about her shoulders a white cape, the colour of penance and purity. Around her neck she fastened a single strand of pearls, each lustrous orb a silent prayer for mercy. She had been told to prepare for the scaffold at 9 o'clock sharp, but as the hour came and went, no summons arrived. Inside the cold stone cell, time stretched in silent torment. The guards outside her door shifted uneasily. They, too, felt the weight of expectation. Yet none dared speak. It was not until the slow tolling of 2 additional bells, 11 strokes in total, that the door finally swung open, revealing a small company of men sent to guide her through the labyrinthine corridors. The low platform awaited her on Tower Hill, built to barely 4 feet in height, so every spectator could witness the final moments of a queen. As Anne walked, her steps were measured and steady, the soft rustle of her skirts echoing faintly in the narrow passages. The occasional torch flickered against the damp walls, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance mournfully at her side. Though her heart pounded like a distant drum, Anne kept her posture regal, her head held high, shoulders squared, eyes forward. When she emerged onto the scaffold, the hush of the assembled crowd was deafening. Noblemen in velvet cloaks, soldiers in metal breastplates, and common folk pressed close, their faces drawn and expectant. There was no cheering, only the quiet rustle of cloaks and the soft murmur of prayers. Anne offered a brief, solemn nod to the Duke of Norfolk, who stood flanked by his peers. Then she removed her headdress and cape, laying them gently upon the platform's edge. Kneeling with precise composure, Anne folded her hands and bowed her head. Her throat bared to the chill breeze. Some accounts hold that she spoke words of forgiveness, pardoning her executioner and accepting her fate, while others insist she used those final moments to denounce the cruelty of Henry's machinations, reminding all present of the king's betrayal. Perhaps both are true? For in that solemn silence, her voice, whether loud or low, would have carried like a song of defiance. Herr Executioner, the French master Jean Rombaut, approached with a soft, unhurried step, clad in plain black and hooded. He carried the slender French sword beneath a bundle of straw, so its edge would not glint prematurely. Anne remained still, her shoulders relaxed as though she were drifting into prayer rather than preparing to die. A single mourner's lament, the distant clang of a bell, and then the blade whispered free of its cover. In one fluid motion, the sword descended. The hush cracked with a collective gasp as Anne's head fell upon the straw-strewn platform. Observers later claimed her lips continued to move in silent prayer long after the stroke, her body trembling, barely perceptible in the cold dawn light. Jean Rombaut lifted the severed head, turning it so the crowd could see the final, haunting testament to a life ended with surgical precision. For a moment, the Tower Hill air held its breath. Then came the soft weeping of some, the stifled sobs of others who could not bear the sight. Anne's remains were swiftly gathered, her body folded into a crude wooden chest, meant for storing weapons, the head laid between her clasped hands. There was no ceremonial hush for her burial. The coffin was closed, nails driven home in silent haste. As the crowd slowly dispersed, a melancholy stillness lingered. The torchlight flickered one last time before guttering out, and the platform was dismantled, leaving only the imprint of steps and the faint scent of cold steel. In the fading grey of morning, the tower resumed its ancient vigil. Stone walls, keeping the memory of Anne's final act a quiet, dignified defiance in the face of unrelenting cruelty. Her death did not truly end when her head left her shoulders. Anne's body was folded, limbs creased like fragile letters into an old wooden chest once used to store arrows. The lid closed over her too brief form, and her severed head was gently laid between her crossed feet, as though in some grim, sorrowful embrace. There was no ritual, no whispered prayers, no tearful farewell from clergy or kin. In the dim quiet of St. Croix, Peter Advincula's consecrated ground, she was buried in an unmarked grave, her coffin lowered without ceremony and covered with cold earth. As the soil settled, King Henry VIII turned his attention to erasing every trace of the Queen who had once reigned at his side. Portraits of Anne, those rare images that captured her serene grace, were torn from their frames and flung aside like unwanted scraps of paper. Carved shields bearing her personal arms were ground down until only faint hollows remained. Their once bold AR monogram, worn smooth beside the still proud HR of the King, wherever Anne's name or emblem had appeared in tapestries, on royal seals. Above palace doorways, the chisel and hammer were set to work, as though the very memory of her existence offended the air. Within the royal records, Anne's lineage was severed with similar ruthlessness. A decree declared her daughter, Elizabeth, to be a bastard, thus stripping the child of any claim to succession. The young princess, who had tasted both the fullness of royal privilege and the bitterness of her mother's fall, now faced a future unmoored from the throne. No longer would Elizabeth's name appear in courtly announcements. No longer would she be addressed with royal honours. In a single stroke, the monarchy sought to erase not only Anne's life but also her bloodline. 11 days passed after Anne's burial, and scarcely had the dust settled over her neglected resting place when Henry moved swiftly to secure his legacy. On the 12th of June, the court buzzed with rumours Jane Seymour, a lady of quiet demeanour and discreet loyalty, was to become the new queen. Within the hour, the marriage contract was proclaimed, as though it had been drafted months ago rather than mere days after his first wife's demise. Courtiers whispered that Henry praised Jane as supremely devoted to the crown, a compliment so bland it seemed contrived to vindicate his haste. In those 11 days, Anne's memory was not allowed, even the courtesy of mourning. The bells that might have tolled in her honour remained silent, while trumpeters sounded fanfares to welcome Jane to court. At a banquet held to celebrate the new engagement, toasts were offered to Her Majesty Jane, with a cheer that echoed hollowly through the hall, a cheer that rang in Elizabeth's ears as a cruel mockery of what had been stolen from her mother. Yet, for all the pageantry and the polished speeches, a hush lingered within the palace walls. The empty corridors that once housed Anne's laughter now felt cavernous and echoing, as though the stones themselves remembered the kindness and courage of the woman they had sheltered. Servants who had served Anne noted how quickly her chambers were repurposed, her belongings dispersed among favoured ladies, her personal prayer book relegated to a dusty shelf in the chapel. In the hush before dawn on the day of his betrothal to Jane, Henry walked the palace gardens alone, pausing by a rosebush where Anne had often strolled. The petals were pale with the morning dew, and in that quiet hour, the king's reflection shimmered in the stagnant pool nearby. Some said he gazed long at his own image, as though pondering the price he had paid to strengthen his throne. Yet within hours, the mirrors were covered in cloth, for no royal should linger over the past. When Jane Seymour was escorted through the same halls Anne had once traversed, the guards set aside their sombre sorrow and adopted a brighter demeanour. They lined the tapestried walls in 2 neat rows, their spears resting against the stone, as if to form a guard of honour. Jane's steps, though measured, carried a subtle grace, a grace that invited comparison to the woman whose memory had so recently been buried in the silent chapel. But no one spoke of Anne as she swept by. Her name was omitted even from polite conversation. That evening, as candles flickered in the grand hall and the tables brimmed with delicacies, the guests raised their cups to Jane's health. The hall, which would once have hushed at the mention of Anne's name, now buzzed with anticipation for the future queen. Elizabeth, hidden among her governess and silent as a shadow, felt the world shift beneath her feet. In her small hand, she clasped a fragment of ribbon, once the pale blue of her mother's sleeve torn from her sleeve by a careless attendant. She pressed it to her lips, tasting the faintest trace of rosewater perfume. A last reminder that Anne had walked these corridors not long ago. In the weeks that followed, Jane settled into her new role with careful deference. She learned the nuances of courtly ritual, practicing curtsies before gilded mirrors, until her reflection seemed unfamiliar. Courtiers vied to curry favour, whispering that she was the saviour of the realm, the balm for all ills. The golden bracelets on her wrists jingled softly as she moved, evoking the distant reprimand of Anne's pearls, a heavy, maternal reminder of a queen who had loved too deeply. Amid the glittering balls and the orchestrated ceremonies, the truth of Anne's erasure persisted in quiet corners. In the stables, the grooms told one another that the new queen walked the gardens at dusk, pausing beside the same flowering rosebush where Anne had once lingered. Some swore they saw Jane brush a single blossom aside, as though paying silent tribute to her predecessor. But no poet dared to pen verse to that effect, for it would be treason to praise the ghost of a queen whom the throne had chosen to forget. And so life at court resumed its gilded pace. Ignoring the void Anne had left, her name survived only in hushed prayers of those who remembered her kindness, whispered in supplication for the child deemed illegitimate. As the candles in the chapel of St. Yves, Peter Advincula, burned low each night, a solitary nun might softly chant Anne's name before drifting into slumber, keeping watch over her unmarked grave. Outside, the tower stood silent sentinel, its stones holding the echoes of her final days. Even as the world beyond marched on, eager to embrace its new queen, as though no tragedy had ever occurred at all. After the French blade fell, the tragedy did not end with the final stroke. Jean Rombaut, the executioner summoned from across the channel, stepped forward and swept the bundle of straw away from his sword. Ina de liberate. Public gesture. He lifted the severed head of Anne Boleyn for all to see. The assembled crowd gasped as they witnessed an astonishing sight. The Queen's eyes flickered, and her lips twitched for a full 15 seconds, as though retaining some shred of awareness in that final, dreadful instant. Witnesses later testified that the unconscious shudders and faint eyelid movements betrayed a momentary recognition, a haunting testament to the human soul's reluctant departure. This macabre display served a grim purpose to cement Henry's power in the minds of all who watched. The message was clear: when a monarch decrees death, even death itself becomes an instrument of terror, a spectacle calculated to quell any whisper of dissent. The crowd, stunned into silence by the raw brutality, felt the weight of the king's authority press upon them more heavily than the damp morning air. No sooner had Rombo departed with his grim trophy than court orders were issued to obliterate every trace of Anne's existence. There would be no state funeral, no gilded coffin befitting a queen. Instead, her body was hastily wrapped in simple grey cloth, an unceremonious shroud, and folded into an ancient wooden chest once used to store arrows. The chest, far too small for her form, required the devoted efforts of several attendants to cram her limbs inside. There were no ceremonial prayers at St. Quating, Peter ad vincula. No choir sang requiems for the fallen queen. Only a handful of loyal women carried the heavy chest to its final resting place in an unmarked plot within the chapel's cold, hallowed grounds. They laid her to rest beside other victims of royal justice, their names forgotten, their stories untold, save for the silent sympathy they inspired in each other's hearts. Meanwhile, in the days that followed, a ruthless campaign of erasure swept through the palace. Skilled artisans and labourers were commanded to dismantle every monument to Anne's reign. Her painted likenesses were pried from walls, their empty frames left dangling like broken promises. Relief carvings bearing her personal arms, AR etched beside Henry's HR, were ground down, until the stone read like bare memory. Even her name on royal seals and documents was chiselled away, as though the very act of writing Anne Regina had become a blasphemy. Parliament convened swiftly to codify the erasure. A decree declared Elizabeth, Anne's beloved daughter, a bastard, stripping her of all titles and claims to the throne. The young princess whose life had once glittered with possibility was reduced to a child of no rank. Adrift in the land where her mother had once been sovereign, the legal documents were amended in black ink and stamped with the royal seal, as though to burnish the lie with the force of state power. In barely a week, every trace of Anne's presence in the kingdom was being methodically expunged. Journal entries, letters, and court records that once spoke her name were altered or destroyed. Even private correspondences among courtiers were scrutinized. Those found mentioning the late queen were seized and locked away, never to be read again. The archbishops and bishops, once Anne's spiritual advisors, were instructed to omit her from sermons and prayers, a spiritual vacuum to match the physical void. Henry, ever eager to move forward, commissioned a massive refurnishing of Anne's former apartments. New tapestries depicting Jane Seymour's upcoming nuptials were hung, where Anne's coronation banners had once draped. Chambers once scented with the lavender she favoured were now perfumed with rosewater for the new queen. The palace staff whispered that Henry himself inspected the changes, nodding in approval as the tapestries fell into line, each strand weaving a future that denied all memory of the past. Within the space of just a few days, the palace seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, as if freed from a burden that had become too heavy to bear. Courtiers who had grieved in silence found themselves compelled to don smiles and speak only of Jane's virtues. The very stones of the tower, which had watched Anne's final days, appeared to absorb the hush, their ancient faces unreadable beneath the shifting light of torches. And still, beneath the polished veneer of courtly pomp, the ghost of Anne lingered in hidden corners. In the chapel where she lay unmarked, a single nun kept vigil by candlelight, murmuring prayers that fluttered like moths against the walls. In the stables, grooms spoke softly of seeing a pale figure drift past the stable doors at dusk, clad in grey and white. But these whispers remained just that echoes in the dark corridors of a realm determined not to remember. So ended the final act of Henry's ruthless drama, the execution of a queen's memory, orchestrated with the same cold precision as her physical demise. In his quest to eliminate any trace of a past he deemed inconvenient. Henry VIII had revealed the full measure of his cruelty. He did not stop at her death. He condemned her to oblivion, erasing her name from hearts and histories alike. And thus, the empire marched on, its gaze fixed firmly upon the future, while the silent graves of the forgotten lay beneath the cool earth, where only the sleepiest prayers dared to wander. Following the brutal spectacle of Anne's execution, Henry VIII wasted no time in securing the future of his dynasty. A mere 11 days later, the court buzzed with rumours that he would wed Jane Seymour. This rapid turn of events was not born of love, but of calculated strategy. The king needed an heir, and more importantly, a demonstration that the throne could not be shaken by the downfall, even the death of a former queen. Jane was chosen for her unwavering loyalty and her noble bloodline, qualities deemed essential to produce the next monarch. In Henry's mind, power stood above all else, even above the sanctity of marriage. Within the gilded walls of the palace, a strict edict was issued. Mention of Anne Boleyn was forbidden. State documents, poems, letters, and chronicles were purged of her name. Clergy who dared speak of mercy or justice found their voices stilled by the weight of royal command. To invoke Anne's memory became synonymous with treason, a challenge to the unassailable authority of the sovereign. This was more than a personal vendetta. It was a chilling decree aimed at extinguishing any spark of dissent. In Henry's realm, forgetting Anne was as imperative as her execution. Poor Elizabeth, Anne's young daughter, bore the heaviest burden of this erasure. Stripped of her birthright and branded illegitimate, she was left to navigate the rigid hierarchy of court as a nameless outsider. The same halls that had once welcomed her as princess now echoed with murmurs of disdain. Chairs meant for royal children remained empty at her side. Courtiers turned away, citing protocol rather than compassion. Elizabeth's childhood, already a fragile thing, shivered under the cold regard of nobles who feared proximity to a shadowed lineage. Despite her bleak circumstances, Elizabeth found a sliver of solace in the kindness of select attendants. Gentle women whispered prayers for her future. Recalling the Queen, her mother had been. In the late hours, they would tiptoe to her chamber, offering morsels of bread and soft words of encouragement. Though the palace doors clicked shut on her prospects, these small acts of care rekindled a spark of hope within the lonely child. Each whispered blessing became a seed of resilience planted in her heart. Meanwhile, Jane Seymour donned the mantle of queen with quiet dignity. She moved through court with a measured grace, soft smiles hinting at her acceptance of this precarious role. Henry, absorbed in the promise of a male heir, lavished her with public displays of favour, gifts of silk, jewels, and praise. Yet even as Jane ascended, the void left by Anne's memory lingered in the corridors. Servants who once tended Anne's rose garden now found themselves guiding Jane through the same fragrant paths, unaware of the ghostly echo of the late Queen's footsteps. In this tense atmosphere, Catherine Parr, Henry's eventual sixth wife and Elizabeth's stepmother, emerged as a vital protector of the young princess. When Henry's health declined in his later years, Catherine's compassion and political acumen restored Elizabeth's standing. She gathered allies among sympathetic courtiers and encouraged the king to reconsider the status of his daughter. Under Catherine's influence, documents were quietly amended, and Elizabeth's legitimacy was acknowledged once more. The reinstatement of her titles marked the beginning of a profound transformation in her fortunes. With her status restored, Elizabeth began to flourish under Catherine's mentorship. She was educated alongside Jane's own children, learning languages, literature, and statecraft. The court that once marginalized her now witnessed her intellect and poise. Anne's daughter, once silenced by decree, found her voice echoing in paved halls and marble chambers. Yet even as Elizabeth's star ascended, she carried with her the memory of a mother erased from history, a poignant reminder of injustice endured. In the years that followed Henry's passing, Elizabeth's path to the throne became clear. Upon Catherine Parr's death and the boyish reign of Edward VI, Elizabeth's claim gained momentum. When she finally took her place as queen, she did so with measured resolve and a keen awareness of the lessons of the past. Her reign would be characterized by both mercy and strength, perhaps influenced by the memory of her mother's fate and the imperative to maintain balance between power and compassion. Throughout Elizabeth's reign, Anne Boleyn's legacy, though officially expunged, lived on in whispered recollections and private remembrances. Poets penned veiled verses that spoke of a fallen queen whose spirit watched over her daughter's triumph. Artists sketched furtive portraits in candlelit rooms, etching Anne's likeness in ash and charcoal. These clandestine tributes ensured that her essence endured, even as official records remained intent on forgetting. Thus, the saga of Anne Boleyn reached its quiet culmination in her daughter's sovereignty. The woman who had been executed, denounced, and erased, found her spirit honoured in the very kingdom that had once sought to obliterate her. Elizabeth's victory, tempered by justice and guided by benevolence, stood as a testament to Anne's enduring influence. In every corner of England, from the rose gardens of Greenwich to the lofty spires of London, her memory whispered on the breeze, a lullaby of courage and sacrifice for those willing to listen. In the wake of Anne Boleyn's public erasure, the cultural fallout in England proved as insidious as any blade. Manuscripts and personal letters that once bore her name were seized and burned or locked away in secret vaults, leaving future historians with only fragments of the truth. Official chronicles, carefully guarded by noble families, told a different story. Anne had gone quietly, obediently. Her death, a peaceful surrender to fate. The harsher realities, Henry's brutality, Anne's desperate fight against injustice, the personal tragedy that unfolded behind closed doors were either omitted entirely or buried in classified annotations never meant for public eyes. Yet amidst the sanitized narratives, a handful of hidden documents survived, passed down through generations from Lady Kingston's own descendants. These papers revealed a far darker picture. They spoke of early morning sobbing, echoing through the cold stone corridors, of desperate whispers for justice that were met with threats and intimidation. They recorded the names of those too frightened to speak, whose testimonies were extorted through force. Beneath the inked lines lay the muffled groans of a woman enduring torment in her cell. Night after night, as the world outside carried on in ignorance, despite these secret archives, the official tide of history remained firmly in Henry's favour. In the grand halls and public records, Anne was immortalised as a traitor, a victim of her own supposed transgressions, rendered harmless by the humane stroke of a French sword. Any reference to witchcraft, incest, or high treason was repeated without question, reinforcing the image of a queen brought low by her own failings, rather than by a king's calculated cruelty. This persistent distortion ensured that Anne's true story would slip further into the shadows with each passing year. Because of this systematic erasure, Anne Boleyn endures today as a symbol of unchecked authority and political atrocity. Her tale is a chilling reminder that power, wielded without restraint, can destroy not only lives but also memories. In a single morning's decree, a ruler could obliterate a person's body, her reputation, and the very record of her existence. The calculated coldness of Henry's approach, from Anne's confinement and coercive interrogations to the theatrical trial and selection of a supreme execution method, to the ruthless excision of her name from all public and private archives, revealed a monarch who felt no remorse. Rather than mourn his former wife, he used her death as a demonstration of absolute dominion. In the centuries that followed, poets and playwrights seeking to capture the darker side of Tudor history often struggled to piece together Anne's truth. Their source material was incomplete, scattered among dingy vaults and fragmented diaries, yet echoes of her suffering found their way into sonnets and dramas. As artists dared to hint at the injustices concealed by royal decree, Small, clandestine gatherings in dimly lit chambers gave voice to the genuine grief of those who remembered the sweet cadence of Anne's laughter, her compassion for the poor, her fierce intellect that shone even in captivity. In these whispered retellings, her humanity was resurrected, if only for a fleeting moment. Modern historians, armed with newly uncovered letters and codices, have begun to restore Anne's place in history. They examine the charred edges of burned documents, the faint indentations left by quills on parchment, each subtle clue a testament to her life and death. Through painstaking scholarship, scholars reconstruct the woman behind the legend, a queen who challenged the mightiest king of her age, whose strength of spirit endured even as her body was brutalized and her honor defamed. Their work stands in stark contrast to the official records Henry left behind, reclaiming Anne's narrative from the depths of oblivion. Yet even as her story emerges from the archive's shadows, the cautionary tale remains absolute power, wielded without accountability, can command not only the body, but the collective memory. Anne Boleyn's ordeal teaches that the most terrifying weapon of all is the erasure of truth. When records are altered, names scratched out, and stories rewritten to serve the ambitions of the powerful, society loses its compass. The line between justice and tyranny blurs, leaving future generations vulnerable to repeating the same horrors. In remembering Anne Boleyn, we honor more than her tragic fate. We affirm the necessity of preserving history in all its complexity. We acknowledge the courage of those who risked retaliation to record her suffering, and we validate the quiet resistance of artists and scholars who refuse to let her be forgotten. Their dedication ensures that Anne's legacy endures not as the meek, obedient figure painted by her enemies, but as a resilient woman whose ordeal stands as a monument to the dangers of unchecked authority. And so, in the hushed corners of libraries and the margins of scholarly tomes, Anne Boleyn's true story persists. Though Henry VIII sought to obliterate her memory, her voice rises again, soft, persistent, and unwavering. A lullaby for the sleeping conscience of history. In its gentle refrain lies the enduring lesson that power must be tempered by compassion, that truth must be guarded against the chisel and the sword, and that a single act of remembrance can outlast even the most ruthless attempt at erasure. In the soft patter of historical remembrance, Anne Boleyn gradually emerged from the mists of time as a veiled legend, her story obscured by layers of deliberate forgetfulness. Modern scholars and writers, drawn by the faint echoes of her fate, began to unearth hidden archives. They pored over clandestine court records, cross-referencing them with French and Spanish diplomatic correspondence, and slowly pieced together the portrait of a queen who was both courageous and compassionate. Anne was not merely the victim of masterful deceit. She became a symbol of unyielding hope for justice, of serene patience in the face of oppression, and of spiritual resilience that rose above the cruelty inflicted upon her. In the realm of popular culture, Anne Boleyn's saga found life in novels, films, and stage productions. Each creative work chose a different lens through which to view her life. Some focused on the tranquil days before she was drawn into the whirlpool of court politics, capturing her gentle laughter in sunlit gardens. Others dwelled on the harrowing psychological torture she endured, portraying her solitary vigils under torchlight and the haunting hush of her caged cell. Still others staged the mock trial as a grand spectacle, complete with lavish costumes and an audience of waxen nobles, before culminating in her final, resolute kneel beneath the gleaming French sword. Even though the full truth remained elusive, the image of Anne standing tall amid impossible circumstances, then kneeling in quiet dignity, etched itself into the collective imagination as a poignant testament to the tragedy of power abused. Thanks to the tireless efforts of 20th and 21st century historians, many sealed documents were finally opened to the public. Among these were the personal journals of Lady Kingston's descendants, official dispatches once hidden in Spanish embassies, and even fragments of diplomatic tapes recorded on fragile wax cylinders. These newly recovered sources confirmed what many had long suspected: the charges against Anne were fabrications, designed to give the illusion of justice while serving political ambition. The testimonies of coerced witnesses were revealed to be riddled with contradictions. The so-called love letter that sealed her fate was nowhere to be found in its original form. This wealth of evidence reconstructed Anne Boleyn not as a passive casualty, but as a woman of sharp intellect and abundant empathy, whose greatest fault was to challenge the inexorable will of a king. Within academic circles, the re-evaluation of Anne's story sparked lively debates about the nature of power and memory. Conferences convened in quiet university halls, where dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light, and scholars presented papers on the interplay between historical erasure and collective guilt. Some argued that Anne's mythic status underscored the necessity of preserving marginalized voices in history. Others reflected on how the king's ruthless censure served as an early example of propaganda's might to rewrite the past. Through these discussions, Anne's legacy evolved from mere footnote to instructive parable, teaching that a single decree could reshape reality, but could never entirely extinguish the flicker of resistance that lies within the human heart. In the arts, playwrights revived the story with renewed fervour. A London theatre staged The Silent Crown, a play in 3 acts that shifted between gilded palace interiors and the stark austerity of Anne's cell. The second act, heavy with whispered soliloquies and the scratching of quills against parchment, left audiences hushed at the end, a palpable ache settling in the quiet aisles. Cinema, too, embraced her narrative. An independent studio produced a haunting black-and-white film called Eyes in the Straw, its final scene lingering on the flutter of Anne's eyelids as the camera held the unforgiving blade in soft focus. Each rendition, though different in style, honoured the core of her experience, her steadfast grace amidst calculated cruelty. Emerging from these artistic endeavours was a renewed public interest in commemorating Anne. Small plaques began to appear in historical districts, marking spots where she once walked. In the Tower Chapel, a discreet memorial was installed, bearing her name in silver script, no longer erased, but shining softly against the stone. Local historians organised guided twilight tours, reciting her story beneath gaslit lanterns so visitors could sense the chill of those fateful nights. Schools incorporated her tale into lesson plans on critical thinking and the perils of unchecked authority. Through these grassroots efforts, Anne Boleyn's memory permeated the cultural landscape once more, reminding all who paused to listen of the enduring power of truth. Even with her story restored, the resonance of Anne's ordeal cast a gentle, sombre pall over her legacy. Her life and death became a rallying cry for human rights activists, who likened her fate to that of countless victims, silenced by oppressive regimes. In quiet corners of the world, advocates for justice invoked her name in speeches and writings, standing on the principle that no person's experiences should be lost to the sweep of political expediency. Artisans crafted small keepsakes, pearl-shaped charms, and silver locket portraits to honour her memory, offering tangible reminders that even in the darkest chapters, the human spirit can find ways to endure. Thus, Anne Boleyn's transformation from erased queen to luminous emblem of fortitude speaks to the alchemy of remembrance. By breathing life back into her story through diligent scholarship, imaginative retellings, and communal acts of homage, the world reclaimed an essential fragment of its past. In doing so, we safeguard against the complacent drift towards forgetting, recognizing that the lessons etched in Anne's trials and in the attempt to expunge her from history remain as vital now as they were 4 centuries ago. And so, with each whispered recounting and every careful study, Anne Boleyn's quiet heroism drifts through time like an autumn breeze, lulling us to heed the echoes of justice long asleep. Anne Boleyn's legacy extends far beyond the hushed galleries of history museums. It resonates in the ongoing struggles for human rights and women's empowerment today. She stands as a sombre exemplar of resistance against tyranny, a reminder of the power of truth, and the necessity of asserting one's voice in the face of political coercion. In the decades following her ordeal, numerous organizations and scholarship funds have been established in her name, dedicated to supporting women who have suffered abuse, prisoners of conscience, and individuals wrongfully incarcerated. These initiatives, often housed in modest offices and run by small but passionate teams, provide legal aid, counseling, and financial assistance to those whose stories mirror Anne's in their breadth of injustice and their hunger for justice. In England, the year 2019 marked a profound moment of collective remembrance and activism. On the 483rd anniversary of Anne's martyrdom, a coalition of human rights advocates and feminist groups organised a commemorative march at the Tower of London. As dawn mist drifted over the ancient ramparts, marchers carried banners proclaiming "True Queen of Hearts," an evocative tribute to Anne's courage and compassion. They demanded formal recognition of all titles wrongfully stripped from her daughter, Elizabeth, whose very birthright had once been cast into doubt. This peaceful demonstration, though gentle in tone, unleashed a wave of global attention. Journalists and historians shared Anne's story on international broadcasts, while social media campaigns trended under hashtags such as Remember Anne Boleyn and Queen's Voice. The event underscored a vital truth: justice delayed can still ignite the conscience of nations. Anne's story continues to echo through the centuries, its reverberations felt in boardrooms, classrooms, and protest camps around the world. When women gather to challenge systemic discrimination, to demand parity in political representation, or to seek accountability for gender-based violence, they invoke Anne's memory as a symbol of both suffering and triumph. In university lecture halls, professors cite her experience when discussing the fragility of democratic principles and the perils of unchecked executive power. In community centers, activists show film clips of her trial reenactments to illustrate how propaganda can be wielded to rewrite history. Through these varied forms of engagement, from academic symposiums to grassroots rallies, Anne Boleyn's life reminds us that absolute power is rarely absolute in practice. It depends on silence and complicity to endure. The campaign to restore Elizabeth's rightful status also gained new life from Anne's revived memory. Scholars and legislators, moved by the 483rd anniversary parade and its surrounding discourse, proposed motions in local councils and parliamentary committees to posthumously reinstate Elizabeth's titles, though the path to legal recognition remains fraught with procedural hurdles and historical complexities. The very act of raising these motions illustrates how Anne's legacy shapes contemporary governance. It sends a message that history is not an immutable record, but a living dialogue, one in which past wrongs can be acknowledged and remedies sought, even centuries after the original injustice. Ultimately, the saga of Anne Boleyn rings as a cautionary tale about the corrosive effects of unbridled authority. Her execution and subsequent erasure from the annals of power exemplify how political regimes can obliterate not only individual lives, but also collective memory and cultural identity. When a ruler decrees that a person must be forgotten, he or she wields a weapon comparable to any sword, the power to determine who shall be remembered and who shall vanish. In erasing Anne from official records, Henry VIII sought to demonstrate his unchallenged sovereignty, but instead he revealed the inherent vulnerability of autocratic rule, its ultimate reliance on the consent of those who record and recall history. By confronting Anne Boleyn's story today, we reaffirm the necessity of checks and balances, the safeguarding of free expression, and the enduring value of historical truth. Her life urges us to scrutinize the mechanisms by which power consolidates itself and to remain vigilant against efforts to suppress inconvenient facts. In honoring Anne, we honor the countless unnamed individuals who have likewise suffered under the weight of despotism, and by preserving her memory through marches at ancient towers, scholarships in her name, and the written word, we ensure that the lessons of her ordeal remain engraved in the collective consciousness. As twilight falls on another era of political tumult and social awakening, Anne Boleyn's legacy continues to lull us into reflection, a gentle reminder that even the stillest echoes of injustice demand to be heard. In the soft hush of our shared remembrance, we find both a warning and a beacon that true justice rests not in the power to erase, but in the courage to remember and to speak the truth, even when all else conspires to silence it. After the veil of secrecy was drawn back, and the hidden court documents and personal letters came to light, many modern historians began to reassess Henry VIII's role in the tragic saga of Anne Boleyn. They pored over brief, but telling entries in Jean Rombaud's executioner's journal. Rombaud, the French master, had recorded intimate details of the day. His words spoke of a sword light as a feather and of a queen stepping onto the scaffold with unwavering dignity. A portrait starkly at odds with the caricature painted by official Tudor annals. By comparing these French dispatches with the heavily edited English chronicles, scholars uncovered a side of Anne Boleyn, rarely acknowledged in public records, a woman of sharp resolve. Her composure intact, even as fate unleashed its cruelest designs upon her. Among those leading this scholarly revival were Professor Alison Weir and David Starkey, whose meticulous research revealed that the sanitized image of Anne as meek and saintly was but a fragment of a far richer story. They unearthed a French attendant's account, written in careful script, describing Anne's whispered prayer on the scaffold. "I beseech the welfare of this realm, not the mercy of my flesh." This final utterance, recorded by a sympathetic courtier, testified to Anne's steadfast loyalty to her kingdom rather than any personal plea for survival. When Weir and Starkey cross-referenced this entry with Lady Kingston's detailed reports and the diplomatic letters exchanged between Paris and London, they found a consistent portrait of a queen possessing political acumen and intellectual vigour. Far from a simple victim, Anne Boleyn had been a thoughtful leader, aware of her duties and determined to protect her people's welfare, even in her darkest hour. This body of research did more than illuminate Anne's personal tragedy. It reframed our understanding of the entire Tudor political landscape. Through this new lens, Henry VIII ceased to be remembered as a genteel monarch of grand pageantry and chivalric grace. Instead, he emerged as a ruthless sovereign, willing to employ any means psychological torture, coerced testimony, and a contrived trial to secure his throne. The haunting image of Anne, her spirit undimmed as she knelt beneath the gleaming French blade, underscored the stark contrast between a ruler's unbridled authority and a subject's quest for justice. In academic circles, the implications were profound. University seminars dedicated entire sessions to the juxtaposition of Rombaud's eyewitness account and the doctored English histories. Students listened in near silence, as lecturers described how the French journal described Anne's final steps in strikingly vivid detail. She walked as though blessed by angels. Rombaud had written, "To her silhouette, a beacon of calm resolve against the rising mist." These words, once hidden in archives, now formed the cornerstone of a recalibrated narrative, one that placed Anne's courage at the heart of her legacy. Meanwhile, biographies of Henry VIII published in the early 21st century bore new passages, drawing praise and controversy alike. Critics argued that Weir and Starkey's findings were speculative, yet the sheer weight of corroborating evidence, handwritten prayers, embassy dispatches, and secret court records rendered the traditional portrayal increasingly untenable. As the debate unfolded in scholarly journals and public radio programs, Anne Boleyn's story became a case study in the fragility of historical memory, how those in power can shape narratives, and how the diligent excavation of primary sources can restore voices once silenced. This renewed focus on Anne also inspired a wave of interdisciplinary inquiry. Legal historians examined the trial's procedural anomalies, noting how the composition of the peer jury violated precedents meant to safeguard fairness. Psychologists studied her cell confinement, exploring how prolonged isolation and surveillance shattered, yet ultimately fortified her mental resilience. Political theorists cited Anne's ordeal when discussing the concept of sovereign immunity, questioning whether any ruler should be beyond reproach. Across these varied fields, one theme recurred: Anne Boleyn's life and death offered invaluable lessons about the intersection of power, justice, and individual rights, even outside the academy. Anne's story began to resonate. A documentary filmed on location at Calais and the Tower of London interwove Rombaud's diary entries with sweeping shots of the English Channel at dawn. Viewers watched, rapt, as the camera lingered on the same mist-shrouded waters Anne's executioner had crossed. Interviews with descendants of Lady Kingston revealed how family heirlooms, a scrap of parchment, a worn rosary, had preserved clandestine truths across generations. The film's nocturnal narration, soft and measured, lulled audiences into a contemplative state, blending sorrow with awe at Anne's unyielding spirit. Novels inspired by Anne's life also flourished. One renowned historical fiction writer created a character based on Anne Boleyn, depicting her as both queen and detective, piecing together clues of betrayal while grappling with her own faith. Although fictionalized, the novel remained grounded in primary sources, weaving Rombaud's observations and Lady Kingston's memoranda into its tapestry. Readers reported sleepless nights spent imagining Anne's quiet prayers in the cold stone cell, a testament to the enduring power of her narrative. Throughout all these endeavours, Anne Boleyn's transformation into a symbol of resistance against autocracy became unmistakable. She came to represent more than a tortured queen. She embodied the universal struggle for truth against the machinery of state propaganda. Whenever journalists reported on modern-day political prisoners, they sometimes invoked Anne's name, drawing parallels between her coerced confession and the forced renditions of dissenting voices. In human rights reports, her case was cited as an early example of how legal systems can be manipulated to serve the ambitions of the powerful rather than the cause of justice. By restoring Anne Boleyn's full story, historians, activists, and artists alike ensured that the once-forgotten queen reclaimed her place in collective memory. No longer merely a footnote in Tudor chronicles, Anne emerged as a beacon for all who fight against oppression, a testament to the enduring capacity of the human spirit to confront injustice. And though the mists of time may never fully dissipate, the light of her resilience continues to pierce through, inviting each new generation to remember, to reflect, and to guard the fragile flame of truth against the chill winds of power. In the past decade, several British cultural institutions and museums, most notably the Tower of London exhibition and the Royal Archives, have begun mounting temporary exhibitions dedicated to Anne Boleyn. These immersive displays endeavour to transport visitors back to her final days by reconstructing her dank cell in painstaking detail. Grey stone walls, iron bars, and the narrow, rough-hewn wooden bed she once occupied form the heart of the exhibit. Nearby stands a facsimile of Lady Kingston's journal, open to entries that record Anne's whispered conversations and the soft scrape of quills against parchment. As guests step inside, they can hear a carefully designed soundscape, the distant drip of water, the muffled footfalls of guards pacing the corridor, and a hushed voice murmuring Elizabeth, the Queen's dying invocation of her daughter's name. These sensory elements work together to awaken a profound empathy in visitors, allowing them to feel, however faintly, the oppressive weight Anne carried within those cold walls. Alongside these exhibitions, international scholarly conferences on power and the erasure of history have adopted Anne Boleyn's story as a central case study. Experts convene in lecture halls bathed in pale morning light, their presentations punctuated by the soft rustle of note-taking. They draw parallels between Henry VIII's systematic obliteration of Anne's legacy and the practices of 20th century authoritarian regimes that sought to eliminate inconvenient figures from collective memory. Panelists emphasize a key lesson: without transparent archival practices and vigilant document preservation, any individual, however unjustly condemned, risks vanishing from the historical record altogether. Through these academic forums, Anne's plight resonates far beyond Tudor England, reminding participants that the struggle to safeguard truth against political repression remains ongoing. On the media front, documentaries such as The Erased Queen and podcasts like Echoes of the Scaffold have brought Anne Boleyn's forgotten narrative to millions worldwide. The Erased Queen, a 2-hour film produced by the BBC, intercuts sweeping shots of the tower's ramparts at dawn, with expert interviews and animated reenactments of the trial chamber. Its narration, soft and steady, guides viewers through the chronology of events, pausing at moments of particular poignancy, the hush before the opening of court, the echo of the gavel falling, the solitary tear, tracing a path down Anne's cheek. When the camera returns to the present-day cell reconstruction, the contrast between past and present feels almost eerie, as if the walls themselves remember the Queen's final breath. Echoes of the Scaffold, a weekly audio series released on major podcast platforms, dedicates several episodes to Anne's ordeal. Listeners immerse themselves in layered sound design, the clank of armor, the whisper of silk skirts, the hushed prayers recited in Latin. Episodes reconstruct the day of execution with meticulous care, using first-person narration drawn from Jean Rombaud's French journal and Lady Kingston's notes. As the host recounts the step-by-step preparations for the French sword method, the soft tone and deliberate pacing lull listeners into a contemplative state, evoking both sorrow and awe. Audience feedback often describes the experience as almost dreamlike, an invitation to journey back in time, one sleepy step at a time. These media productions have done more than entertain. They have sparked renewed public interest in honouring Anne Boleyn's memory. Schools across the United Kingdom now incorporate her story into history curricula, encouraging students to reflect on the fragility of justice and the importance of preserving truth. Community theatres stage performances of adapted scenes from The Erased Queen, inviting local actors to step into Anne's shoes and send the Queen's final words echoing through small auditoriums. Social media campaigns rally under tags like Never Forgotten and Anne Boleyn Awakens, sharing snippets of documentaries and podcast audio, along with archival images of the tower and reconstructed artifacts. Through these combined efforts, museum exhibits, academic symposiums, documentaries, podcasts, and grassroots initiatives, Anne Boleyn has reclaimed her place in the collective consciousness, no longer a footnote in Tudor chronicles. She stands as a potent reminder of how easily an individual's life and legacy can be manipulated, suppressed, or erased by power. Today, her story inspires a broad audience to question the narratives they inherit, to seek out primary sources, and to honour the memories of those who suffered in silence. Around the Tower of London, in the hushed galleries of the Royal Archives, and within the quiet attentiveness of podcast listeners preparing for sleep, the spirit of Anne Boleyn endures her voice, once stifled, now softly resonant, guiding us toward a more vigilant safeguarding of history's truth. In popular culture, Anne Boleyn's image has been richly reimagined across a variety of artistic media, each exploring different facets of her life and legacy. Philippa Gregory's historical novel, Queen Without Mercy, delves deeply into Anne's inner world. Portraying the tension between her passionate heart and the heavy weight of royal duty, Gregory gives voice to Anne's private doubts and yearnings, depicting her late-night musings in candlelit chambers as she balances her love for Henry against her commitment to her role as queen. In Gregory's narrative, Anne's internal struggle becomes a mirror for our own, prompting readers to consider how far one might bend to the demands of power before the very soul begins to fracture. On stage, the play Scaffold invites theatregoers to step into the judges' seats themselves. Under dim, flickering lights, the audience listens to actors assume the roles of Anne's peers and the coerced witnesses who condemned her. As the trial unfolds, each member of the audience is given a small tablet presenting contradictory pieces of evidence moments before the verdict. The actors turn to the crowd and ask, "If it were you, how would you decide?" This direct engagement unsettles the comfortable distance between viewer and performer, encouraging a personal reckoning with the nature of justice. In the hushed auditorium, the question lingers like smoke. Can any of us truly claim impartiality when faced with fear and authority? The realm of interactive entertainment has also embraced Anne's story, In the narrative role-playing game Tudor Shadows, players inhabit Anne's shoes in the days leading up to her arrest, and in the desperate aftermath, choices branch into multiple paths one may negotiate with Henry's agents, seeking a political solution. Another may clandestinely rally allies at court in a bid to resist. Still another might attempt a daring escape through the palace's secret tunnels. Each decision carries weighty consequences, alliances forged or broken, whispers of treason, echoed or quelled, the ever-present risk of capture, the game's immersive sound-designed footsteps in echoing corridors, the clink of chains. A distant bell toll blurs the line between entertainment and a thoughtful commentary on the cruelty of absolute rule, even as players savor the agency afforded by controller in hand. The shadows of Tudor power loom large, reminding them that resistance can come at the cost of everything. In contemporary British painting, many artists have turned to surrealism to capture Anne Boleyn's essence. Canvases draped in ashen greys and muted blues portray her with eyes that seem to glimmer with unshed tears. A face at once regal and broken, backgrounds swirl with smoky tendrils, as though history itself is dissolving around her figure. One notable piece shows Anne standing before a warped, floating scaffold, her reflection fractured like cracked glass at her feet. In another, her silhouette dissolves into a flock of birds, wings beating against a stormy sky. These exhibitions urge viewers to consider that while a person's physical presence can be erased by decree, the spirit of resistance and dignity endures beyond any attempted obliteration. Gallery plaques accompanying these works explain that these paintings are more than visual tributes. They are calls to vigilance. They remind us that every society risks repeating such acts of erasure, unless its members commit to remembering even when the past is uncomfortable. Curators arrange these exhibitions in vaulted halls where the hush of visitors' footfalls and the soft hum of the security system create an atmosphere of contemplation, as one stands before a painting of Anne Boleyn's sorrowful yet defiant gaze. A gentle melancholy settles a silent invitation to honor her truth and guard the stories of those whose voices power tried to silence. Across these varied platforms, novels, theatre, video games, and visual art, Anne Boleyn's image has transcended the dusty pages of history books to become a vibrant emblem of resilience. Each retelling, each interpretation offers a different angle on her experience, the tenderness of her heart, the complexity of her choices, the injustice of her trial, and the tragic finality of her execution. Yet in every medium, the message remains consistent. Though tyrants may wield the power to erase names and rewrite records, they cannot fully extinguish the memory of those who stand for justice. As the lights dim in a theatre, as a page turns in a quiet reading nook, or as a controller rests in a player's hands at midnight, Anne Boleyn's story continues to breathe, her figure, painted with surreal brushstrokes, narrated in solemn verse, and simulated in measured gameplay, carries a timeless warning. Let us never forget that history's shadows may fall long, but the glimmer of truth endures in the softest whisper of remembrance. In the gentle hush this creates, we find both sorrow for the past and a resolve to ensure that no one, no matter how powerful their decree, can fully silence a courageous spirit. Through the entire somnolent tale of Anne Boleyn, we can draw many profound lessons and messages for today's audience. First, the story reminds us of the destructive power of absolute authority when a single individual holds too much power not only in title but also in the ability to control information, and collective memory justice can be easily distorted, truth can be concealed, and the suffering of victims can be callously obscured. Henry VIII did not simply behead Anne, he ordered her name erased from every record. That act stands as proof that power does not merely destroy lives, but can also obliterate memory and character. Second, Anne Boleyn's story serves as a warning about the importance of preserving historical records and maintaining objective historical education. When original manuscripts are altered, when a person's very memory can be wiped so thoroughly that no scrap of paper remains to record her final tears. We realize that every document, no matter how small, must be safeguarded and respected. Truth often resides in the smallest details in a tampered diary, in the whispered account of a silent attendant, in a diplomatic letter smudged with ink. Third, Anne Boleyn became an emblem of the pursuit of justice and personal dignity, even when isolated, subjected to psychological torture, and publicly shamed. She steadfastly upheld her responsibility to the realm and maintained her composure upon the scaffold. A fact French executioner Jean Rombaut recorded in his journal. Her attitude shows us that even when every door of power is slammed shut, a person can preserve their integrity and hold on to the hope that justice will transcend political machinations. In our current era, when fake news and conspiracy theories spread across social media, the lesson of Anne Boleyn becomes even more vital. We must remain vigilant about the information we consume, always tracing sources so that history is not rewritten to serve the interests of the powerful. At the same time, we must show empathy and listen to voices that have been forgotten victims of violence, injustice, and oppression. This is the path toward societal progress, preventing the repetition of similar tragedies. Through this video, we learn that justice does not arrive on its own. It must be preserved through knowledge, courage, and careful scrutiny of power. We also recognize the importance of safeguarding collective memory, so that the tragedies of the past become reminders for the future. Above all, Anne Boleyn's story urges each of us to stand up for truth and honor human dignity no matter the circumstances. No matter how small our voice may seem, it can still echo forever in the annals of history.